I see a couple of people are still coming in, but we have to start. I know break is good, but our conversation also here is very important. To that extent, we are going to introduce our panel discussion to talk about a very important topic that I love the most, Smit capture. And for that purpose, I'm going to introduce you our moderator for the panel today, Professor Arnold Smit. Professor has allowed me to shorten it so that we have more time to discuss this relevant topic. So I'm just going to say a few words about it. Professor Arnold is an extraordinary associate professor at Stellenbosch Business School in South Africa, associate professor of business and society at ELDC, Broad School of Management, and he is also an owner of the Wise Banks Limited. He has been training and consulting, and he specializes in values-driven leadership. I love that. Sustainability management and strategy development. And he facilitates learning, dialogue, problem solving through engaging, transformative, and whole person oriented. I also love that. So let's welcome Professor Arnold and find out.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to pass the mic to my fellow panel member here because I've got a clip on. So thank you very much for the introduction. And as I used to say, my mother only intended to call me Arnold. So let's keep it like that. I feel a little bit this morning when we have to deal with a topic like the capturing of states across Africa. I feel a little bit this morning like the time when I was still a parish minister. That's part of my deep past. Then I would get a phone call somewhere on a Saturday evening or during the course of a Sunday or an anxious person on a Monday night, can I quickly come and see you? Because it's very urgent. And then I scratch in my diary for some space to put this person in. And then when we start to talk, they want to talk about a problem that has been building up over years. Like, for instance, a marriage conflict or a family matter or something like that. And then we need to solve it in the moment, in a short, very short space of time. And if I can add a prayer on top of it to just make it go away as quickly as possible, then even the better. So we are actually tackling something massive here in a very, very short space of time, but we will see how it goes. Maybe by means of some orientation, before I introduce our panel. In 2017, I did a values workshop for the Department of the Gauteng government. And two things still live with me until this day. On the floor, there were people who said, higher up, they steal millions. We only help ourselves to some thousands. And then just before lunchtime, there was a gentleman coming to me, and this was kind of my first engagement with this thing about capture. With absolute anxiety in his eyes, he was looking at me and he said, please excuse me for the afternoon session. I have to go and attend a meeting in Van der Bijl Park this afternoon. I am captured. Fear in his eyes. I'm captured, I have to go to a meeting. Then, hearing this province where we are at the moment, and at the university not too far from here, in 2018, the then president of South Africa, or previous president, sorry, of South Africa, yeah, he was still president then, President Jacob Zuma, made an announcement about state capture, and he said a state is composed of three elements. It is the legislature, the executive, and judiciary. That constitutes the state. So let me ask the question, if that is the case, what is this thing called state capture? Does it mean these three arms have been captured? And he also went further and he said, an institution supposed to capture others cannot capture itself. And but that tried to diminish the argument. So if we now try and understand a little bit more about what we're talking about on the back of quite a number of things that has already been said around corruption since yesterday, we could say that state capture is a type of systemic political corruption. I almost want to say, in view of this morning's conversation, a different kind of collective action. But this time on the dark side, or like Leon yesterday spoke to us about the abyss, what's happening down in that abyss on the dark side, a different kind of collective action, in which it's been said that private interests significantly influence the state's decision-making processes to their own advantage, including the legislature, the executive, the ministries, the judiciary, as well as the electoral processes. So just defuting the Jacob Zuma argument, so to speak. Those who have captured the state use their influence to manipulate decision-making processes, access public resources, and protect their own interests. But it then goes further and says that businesses and politicians conspire to influence a country's decision-making processes to advance their own interest, and here comes the crunch, and weaken those laws and neutralizing any agencies that try to enforce it. So we get this whole sense of how systemic it actually then becomes. And I think the Zondo Commission helped us here in South Africa to understand the nature of the behaviors, the consequences of it as it was unfolding in front of us on our television screens over quite a number of months. So, having said this as a background, just a few words about our panel participants. Saima Nimegorbe is the head of risk and compliance of the Development Bank of Namibia. She's online. Saima, as an alumnus also of Stellenbosch Business School, I welcome you this morning. It's nice to have you with us. With me is Dr. Gaspar Stefani, the Chief Executive Officer of Action Aid Mozambique. Having a long history in the NGO environment. Then there is Samuel Camille, the Executive Director of Africa's Voices Foundation, coming to us from Nigeria. Dr. Umubumi Ugunyemi, Senior Lecturer of the Pan Atlantic University, Lagos. Welcome to you as well, Umubumi. I saw this morning that you've also closed your email with Molly. Did I see that correctly? If that's another way of calling you, and then you have me. So I think you get a sense here that we are not a panel of state capture specialists, nor a panel packed with legal minds and so forth. Yes, there are some specifically in terms of Samuel, there's a legal capacity amongst us as well. So our conversation is going to be a bit different. We have decided not to unpack the phenomenon of state capture into detail and trying to cover what is happening all across Africa, but rather to enter the space of the conversation through the interesting angles that we represent on it from our daily jobs and see what we can learn from there, and then also to invite you into the conversation as audience as well. So in the first round, I just want to explore a little bit around the phenomenon. The second round, the Ubuntu connection, and then we will go to a third round, which is about working against it, and then to the concluding remarks. But at that time, I hope that we can rope you in as well. So yesterday, Professor Van Vieren spoke about fighting the monster and turning red signals into green ones. And we will see how we can actually venture from where we are to where we can come. So let me start with Saima. Saima, how pervasive is this really from your perspective? How pervasive is state capture on the African continent? And from the role that you play as the head of risk and compliance in a development bank, I would like to ask, how do you know it when you see it?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. Firstly, good morning to all the conference attendees. I'm really honored to be here, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion and learnings. Firstly, I want to make a statement that I'll center my response around, where I said Africa is really rich. It's a rich continent. Africa has been in poverty for too long. Some African citizens perhaps feels that they are too late to acquire wealth, thus they grab any opportunity to actually get that. But that's not the reason why we should allow or entertain state capture. Now, state capture has spread like wildfire in many African countries. It spread throughout so thoroughly that every person can actually see that. My kids sometimes from school, they ask me questions. They will be like, why is Arnold's kids comes with a V8 Range Cruiser, which I cannot afford? And they're like, but Arnold works with you. And I'll be like, yeah, it is. So you could see that even the children are seeing that from the kids' perspective. Now, take any newspaper of any countries, you will see transactions that are not ethical, you see transactions that are not beneficiary to the state or its people. From my role that I play as head of risk and compliance in a development finance, how do I know that there is state capture when I see it? My outlook on state capture is that it's not really a new phenomenon. We are potentially using it like a different lens to see it. But the main trends that I have observed is that the economic activities and resources has been distorted. You would see that if nothing happens, if no change, the influence that we can have as a development finance, if that doesn't change, the richer will just continue to get richer, the poor dive deeper into poverty, and then we obviously gonna have the issues that we have in Africa. You would also notice that the rules and laws of countries continuously change. I am responsible for compliance, and then you actually see that constantly there is discussion of let's change these laws, let's change that law. But what you see is that the influential community or the elite or the prominent influential persons are actually the one that benefit from the change of those rules. Again, what you see is you have seen that a lot of state-owned enterprises, they are strategically being led by leaders and senior management that were intentionally put there to implement that agenda. Now, again, the commercial public enterprises have the capacity to become financial sustainable and still meets the state mandates of why they were established and become profit-making entities in many African states. But yet they continue to siphon public funds while being led by qualified, really and able professionals. When you see all these events, collectively or separately in our society, you know that there is pervasive state capture.
That's an interesting perspective. In other words, however the constitution might have been set up, governance structures have been set up, you get the sense that there are forces working against that. And this is something that Joseph Stiglitz also wrote about, I think, many years ago, where he said, never trust the legislation that we see just that it's been put out there for the sake of the common good. When power gets involved, power also tends to kind of veer that in the direction of own private interests. So these kind of things, I think that we have been seeing. We've seen it in South Africa and so forth. And it seems that Saima also then highlights for us how prevalent that might be and how our eyes should actually be open for that wherever we find ourselves across the continent and in various countries. I want indeed to say also that when we got to learn the concept here, all of a sudden we realized how actually widespread this really is, and actually going beyond South Africa as well. Saima, before I continue, I just want to say, yes, I do drive a Land Cruiser, but it's 17 years old, and it was bought with the hard-earned money of just a parish minister at that time. So I own it, I hope, in the true sense of the word. So there were very interesting perspectives forthcoming when I had conversations with our panel representatives in our preparations going towards the day. Specifically the NGO perspective, specifically an educational perspective, and also a transitionary perspective and so forth. And I don't want to focus too much when we talk about the link between Ubuntu and state capture, or that kind of, let me rather say, the anti-Ubuntuism in state capture itself. And I want to explore, through the panelists' contributions, I want to explore something more around that, instead of just trying to clarifying or analyzing this phenomenon more and more. So that's where I want to come to you. As I've said, it is so anti-Ubuntu, and it affects the lives of the very people that you work with on a daily basis, the people that you serve. How come that it takes such deep roots on a continent that is so, or supposed to be in terms of its value system, so community oriented? How do we understand this?
Thank you, Arnold. Bom dia, everyone. Well, I'm still thinking from where to start. However, I think that starting what Simon said in the beginning of our intervention, I would say it in a different perspective, saying that Africa has been exporting aid to the West for more than 500 years. We can interpret it in different perspectives. I prefer to say that Africa is exporting aid, although many of us will for sure say something different. And it is, indeed. But I'm saying it because although we are rich countries, we do have a lot of values that really drive our way of living in Africa. We also have received a different way of leading, of governing our institutions, our countries, and those different ways, at some point, they clash with our value systems, with our Ubuntu systems and other value systems that we do have in our continent. And looking from the lens of the work that we have been doing as civil society organization, what we really see is that most of the issues that will really make the poor people, the vulnerable people, really feel the effects of the state capture is the first of them. I would call it the weak governance. Why weak governance? If we do have institutions, we realize from the community perspective to the nation, if we can call like that, that we do our best to respond for what comes from outside and not really from what our values systems says. So what really has value is the laws, is the all those aspects that in the international charters will be ticked as correct. But the others are not really the most interesting and not the valuable, and they will not contribute to our success or development. So from that, we see that our institutions in most of our African countries, not really institutions as we would understand in our value systems, but people that has power to influence. Those represents the institutions and not the institution itself. So it's why I'm bringing the issue of weak institution. But also we do have other challenge, which is the historical context. We have come through a colonialism system, and now we are living a kind of a new colonialism and fighting for decolonization. And the way that we are thinking colonialism or the new colonialism and trying to decolonize is actually somehow bringing I would even call a third generation of colonialism or a third type of colonialism, which we are doing it among ourselves. And it's even sad because we are doing it among ourselves using our value systems to bring the community cohesion is an element that will open space to really not fight all those aspects that are not correct. So we'll look among ourselves and at some point say that, well, we need to protect each other, but protecting in the bad actions and not the good ones. The other point, which I really believe that is crucial when we are looking for our communities, is the resource that we do have. I said before that we are exporting aid. We do have all kinds of resources. So we are really rich countries in Africa. But at the very same time, those resources are used by those that have influence to manipulate our ways of living, to manipulate our ways of governing our countries. It's why the countries that has more resources, usually in our continent, has also more problems, or not democratic, as we believe democracy is. So I feel that those elements would bring a lot of them, like the inequalities, the poverty, the political patronage, which definitely I feel that is something very interesting because the way that our leaders, the way that our politicians and the businessmen work, will realize that they are not different groups. Actually, it's the very same group that has the power of influence, has the politicians' roles, and also at the businessmen. So you will see that all legislations will be designed to respond to their own interest. The business sector will be driven to benefit this smaller group. But at the very same time that they are doing that using the terminology that the West wants to hear, they also use our system value to protect themselves and to make these strong groups. So could really bring more and more elements, but I do believe, in short, that our communities they suffer a lot because they are not allowed to be part of the smaller groups that leads the countries.
So thank you for that. I think there's a question in there I would like to throw out later to the audience if we have time. But I think Samuel would also like to drill down a bit further in this because Samuel, in connecting with what Gaspar just said, in our preparations, you specifically noted the incomplete transition from traditional to democratic systems of governance as kind of a growth medium for state capture. Would you like to say more about that? Because I think it connects well. I mean, we've got a great historic perspective here now. what happened to value systems in general, but you had a very specific point that you've made around this transition gap. Would you like to take us into that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Smit, and good morning from the city in the sun. I'm in Nairobi, not in Nigeria. And indeed, today is not sunny. The sky is overcast. It's raining, but it's beautiful. So I'm glad to join the conversation and to just offer my reflections on this incomplete transition. I think as African societies, we had our long-tested systems of governance and the way we managed our affairs that had settled over a long period of time. These ones were disrupted by colonialism, as my colleague, as my co-panelist has said. And the transition from the traditional to the colonial, which involved delegitimizing our traditional approach to issues, was one of the most successful experiments of colonialism, I would say. And at the end of it, as we gained independence as African countries, we found ourselves having moved away from our traditional systems of governance and embracing new systems, acquired new systems of government and governance and running of our affairs that have no grounding in the African context. We moved away from communities as the locus of governance to inter-ethnic, intercommunal states. That meant that we needed to find uniform ways of managing our affairs under the new structures that the colonialist, brought into our countries. And just to go back from where you had left earlier in your introduction, you talked about the three arms of government. The legislature, the judicature, and the executive. And the incompleteness of this transition, in my view, is founded on a number of precepts. One of them is that, the traditional system had a settled ethical base, a value base, and the human being as viewed in the African concept was a spiritual, a cultural, a social being. If you look at that transition from the traditional to the modern state, the modern state lacks some of those elements in the sense that the law comes in. I know in law we talk about the spirit of the law, but in reality, the law is still, at least from the subconscious of our minds, seen as different from the rules that govern us at a traditional level. And that transition where, the principles of Ubuntu would be transitioned from our traditional view of things to the modern state is where there is a disconnect. And I think many of the leaders who came in after independence continued pretty much with the colonial state, as it were, without transforming it significantly to accord to the perceptions, to the beliefs, to the way of life, the values and the ethics of the African people. And hence, it became very easy for those who came from societies where they were bound by, these cultural norms that included taboos and other enforcement mechanisms that are more fundamental than the police power that the modern state uses, could leave actually their traditional setting and move into the state setting and cause a lot of damage that is quite the antithesis of Ubuntu, where they can go and reach for their own parochial interests, protect their parochial needs. And then you have the issue of capitalism coming in to undermine further the element of our traditional economic and cultural views around wealth and the place of wealth in our society. So that's the place I come from when I say I see an incomplete transition where the traditional has been pretty large abandoned, but the modern state doesn't quite go to the fundamental level, as no fundamental roots as you would find in our traditional system. And for us to be able to deal with the issue of state capture, then we will not succeed if we do not deepen our democracies to a level where they are firmly grounded in our social, cultural, and I would dare say even spiritual basis. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think what I'm hearing you saying is not a call against the modern state, but it's about a conversation, a dialogue that needs to continue, that needs to move on, that needs to go through to its full consequences of incorporating that which has been learned, gained, but also lost in the process. And how do we take that to a different level? But bringing Umumoe in, I was just afraid that we've lost you for a moment, Umumoe. Even more, I think, interesting than the idea of an incomplete transition, you put the language of the challenge of language on the table. And you said in our preparatory discussions that the role that language transitions have played in disconnecting people from their traditional value systems. Now, the question is, how does this contribute to the erosion of Ubuntu on the one hand, or then the traditional value systems on the one hand, and the emergence of state capture on the other end? How do you bring these worlds together? I just found it fascinating that you've put that point on the agenda. I would like to hear more before we continue into the next round of our conversation.
Okay, I'd like to say a good morning to everyone. I'm joining you from Lagos, Nigeria, from the Pan-Atlantic University. And thank you for all the discussions so far. They've been so exciting, even from yesterday. So my point, I think, builds on what Samuel has just spoken about. The idea of a transition from cultural systems to something that is more modern. So what I see happening is that you have concepts that we used in language, and those concepts, those African concepts, promote business ethics. So Ubuntu is an example of them, but there are several others all across Africa. For example, here in Lagos is Western Nigeria, we talk about Omoluabi, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But what I've noticed is that those concepts are not as known as they were because of the translations, or the more, maybe because of the use of new language, English. So I teach a lot of undergrad students. So when I speak with them and I ask, many of them don't speak the languages anymore. So if I tell someone Omoluabi, you can try to translate it. You would get something like somebody who has, good character, be of good behavior. But as I'll explain a bit later, there's a lot more to that concept. So we seem to be forgetting the value that those things had and how they sustained communities to be ethical communities earlier on, in which everybody was concerned about everybody, about the good of other people, a good number of people. Or if someone wasn't doing something right, it wasn't just ignored. People took time to correct each other and to look out for the needs of others. I think that the forgetfulness is not intentional. So while trying to adapt to changing times, to be relevant internationally, which is a very noble cause, to be understood, to transmit a culture. Sometimes when we translate those concepts, it's difficult to capture everything that it means to us. So we tend to lose out some of the richness. So like I said, it's not an intentional thing, because it's good that people do appreciate what's going on in their culture, and that we're able to share the culture and people can see the beauty that you have within the context of Africa. But when you have translations, they may not convey all that the value system means. So things like concepts like Ubuntu, where you live for the others, or you are because the others are, when you translate it to a concern for others, it's not as intense as you would. So the self-centeredness that is enshrined, for example, in state capture can take roots where someone has lost the concept of Ubuntu, someone has lost the concept of Omoluabi. Let me just say a bit more about Omoluabi. So in Yoruba culture, Omoluabi is an epitome of virtue, really. It's the ideal virtuous person. And they were held in high esteem, the preferred candidates for leadership. You would want to have business with them. They're the people you really want to relate with. And when we talk about language, the term Omoluabi, even though it's a word, is a contraction of a noun phrase, which is actually Omoti Oluwabi, which usually means a child or one that is born by the master or lord of character. So you translate that to, be of good character, be virtuous. And it's not what you get when you try and communicate that in a different language, not as intense as when you say Omoluabi, as in you are a child born by the master or lord of character. So that's what I mean when I say sometimes when we're translating, especially since the teaching language for most people in Nigeria actually is English language, which is one of the official languages. It's actually the main official language that everybody speaks. So you really cannot translate that and get that all the richness that the word or the concept translates or transmits when you speak it in the local languages. So and I'd say when you call someone an Omoluabi, who is somebody who combines all virtues, that wouldn't be somebody who supports state capture, whether they're the policy makers or they're part of those few who have the opportunities to hijack policies and resources and use them self-centeredly. If someone is rooted in that philosophy of being someone who is a child born by the master of the law of character, who really wants to be an epitome of virtue, then it's more difficult to convince the person that they should hijack the resources and ignore all the others. Similar to what would happen if somebody really understood what Ubuntu was and grasped it as a philosophy. I think yesterday somebody mentioned I think it was someone from the audience, I didn't quite get the name. In one of the questions or the comments, the person mentioned that sometimes the lack of philosophy or philosophical basis for conversations about managing corruption could be one of the issues that we need to tackle. And I was thinking, state capture is brand corruption, but it's not something that is floating. It's rooted in individuals. So if you have individuals who are conscious of how they should behave, who are conscious of their responsibility towards others, and who really are interested in being respected by society, really wants to give or to serve society, then you'd have less people who want to partake in those situations in which there's state capture or other corrupt practices. And I think that really having that awareness of those concepts, or trying to make sure that they live on, or we revive them, or get people to understand them more as deeply as they were rooted, could help build the character of people who are then going to be leaders, who are going to be in government, who are policy makers, so that you can prevent brand corruption that you see manifested on a national scale, but which starts from character of people involved. And that's what I was thinking when I talked about the role of languages and the meaning that it conveys, and how it's important for people to understand them really and make them part of their lives.
Thank you for that. I think you connect quite well with some of the points that have been made, and also Samuel has just said. It seems as if it highlights another task that we have. Is yes, there is the modern state and there is the modern economy, and it comes with its systems, with its legislation, with its policies, and so forth. But what I hear from what's being said is there is another task, and that is how do we translate? How do we bring that to the person in the street? How do we make sure that there's an embrace of concepts and language and values that has been present there over the ages? So connecting those dots, I think that's a challenge that you lift up for us here. So I want to bring us into the turning of the red signals into green ones, as Leon has alluded to yesterday, and talk about the working against state capture and similar phenomena. Two people, I think, on our panel who really works on the ground and whose life is involved in building agency and voice is really Samuel and Gaspar. So if we go to the ground, if we go to where the ordinary person lives, if we, Samuel, and I would like to start with you, and specifically in terms of your organization and the kind of advocacy work that you are doing, how do we build agency? It's a point that has been made by Professor Breakfast this morning as well, is how do we build agency amongst ordinary people for working against, for standing up, for voicing themselves when these phenomena came around. So Samuel, building voice and agency amongst the people that you work with. And if you have a success story to share with us, that would be great to hear that as well.
Thank you very much. And I think I could take it from saying that the transition, the incomplete transition that I talked about earlier, has implications in the sense that it's difficult for us to go back to our traditional systems of government, partly because our states are made up of different cultures and backgrounds, but partly also because it's been, the erosion of that base has been quite significant. So the way I see as a way of addressing the issue of state capture is really to deepen our democracy. And in order to deepen our democracy, we need to look at the textbook democracy and see how it looks. And I think it's quite appealing. It places the voices of citizens as the principles in a democracy. It's about the will of the people. And in the will of the people, the voice of the people needs to be heard in decision-making. The primary expression of this will being through elections. So we need to bring back that which has been taken away from an effective, credible, and fair elections in our on our continent. And to do this, let us remember that the values, the ethical values of Ubuntu would require that we find a system that enables the best leaders to find their way into leadership, or the best human beings, the best people to find their way into leadership, and find ways of sanctioning those who go against these general principles. We need to breathe life, we need to breathe ethics and values into these democratic processes. One of the things that I lament is the fact that increasingly you see values being thrown away from these systems. And when you try to instill those values, you will see that even where laws do exist to help our societies deal with this, they are not enforced, they are not respected, and there are attempts at every turn to throw away, particularly the ethics and value requirements for leadership. If we do not get this right, we will remain in the situation we are in, and I think the levels of state capture will only be cemented. And I think out of this quagmire, there is the long route, which is usually the deepening of our democracies. And I think we haven't made a lot of progress, to be honest, I think, since independence. It's not a linear journey. It is full of twists and turns. There's progress nonetheless, but I think the progress is quite slow. We need to really revisit our democracies, how we elect our leaders, how we make sure that those who we elect truly are the best, because leadership is about getting the best in society to lead the rest of the society in achieving its aspirations. I think the democratic exercise that we've seen over the last decades in Africa, increasingly you find people who don't reflect or represent the aspirations of the society, manipulating the electoral system so that they can find themselves in leadership. And once they get into leadership, they obviously will not serve the interest of the masses. They serve their own personal or parochial interests, be they political, economic, or even criminal. And I think there are many aspects of that. The other bit I would say is that, regimes involved in wrongdoing or state capture really do rupture at some point. When that rupture happens, I don't think there's a very effective study I can say that shows how this can happen, but there are many examples of when this rupture happens, like happened in Tunisia, happened in Egypt, what we call the Arab Spring. In our own country, in Kenya, I think the transition, the election in 2002 was an important milestone in the sense that the long-serving president who had concluded his 24 years of rule was actually leaving office. And the incoming president ran on a platform of anti-corruption, which meant it was about mending what was wrong with the state machinery. And that captured the imagination of the people. And the people spoke very eloquently through their vote about what kind of state that they wanted. I think the lesson, unfortunately, or that we need to get from here is, again, that these processes are not linear. They are full of twists and turns. And there are those who will be waiting at every turn to subvert either the transition to a higher democracy so that they can continue to benefit from the ineffectiveness of the state machinery and continue, benefiting their parochial interests. So that's the way I would see it. I think the only other element I have seen is that where the state instruments are captured and they are unable to preserve the state itself, or at least meet justice to those who are involved. Sometimes, because we live in a global international community, reaching out to other systems of government out there can actually help. International law can help, and we've seen it a couple of times, but also the jurisdictions of other countries can also help. And I want to give an example, again, from the Kenyan space. We had a drug dealing problem in this country. There are individuals who are involved in international drug dealing who are above the law in the Kenyan space, who are never held to account. Even when they were presented before court, they were never made to answer for their charges. But because of the security, the issues of security, issues of terrorism, people found themselves being held to account in a different jurisdiction, in a fairly internationalized, coordinated manner of holding them to account. And as we speak, they are serving jail somewhere in the US. But the people who are involved in the jurisdictions that were involved in holding them to account are India, Kenya, and the US, and perhaps others in between. So it's possible that the international nature of our existence can also play a part. But I guess that is a small part compared to what the individual citizens, through their vote, are able to achieve if the electoral system is re-engineered to make sure that the best aspirations of the people are realized. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time, so I will bring the educational aspect in back later and so on, and more of the kind of NGO on the ground work. Saima, we've heard quite a lot of strengthening democracy, but when I visit the Development Bank of Namibia's website, I'm staring into a level of corruption awareness that is just, it's just hitting you. Realizing that here is a bank with a high level of sensitivity to create knowledge and sensitivity among the stakeholders, specifically around corruption and related issues. Now, my question is, and once again, it's about how do we bring this to the people? What can a development bank, with the competency and the systems that you've developed, what can you bring to society more broadly in order to strengthen the ordinary citizen around awareness, around education, and around voicing and standing up when these things come to mind.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Arnold. I'm so glad that you were able to recognize our effort to try and collaborate to contribute to really stemming the tide of state capture. As you have brought it down, the Development Bank of Namibia, I have indicated that it's a development finance institution. And we are a state-owned enterprises, very vulnerable to be used for financing state capture project, if I may put it that way. So our mandate, like any other DFI, is really to contribute to the development of the country, contribute to society empowerment, and very importantly, to remain sustainable. Now, how do we do that? How do we help through the competency? We felt that it's our moral responsibility to society to influence policy formulation and implementation. Namibia, like any other country, obviously has the anti-corruption laws that are probably not adequately implemented. We all know that. And obviously, we also know that who is in control of those laws. So what we have done from the Development Bank of Namibia side to try and really help society on that was to develop our staff competency that enable and empower our stakeholder to reflect on their own action by considering the current and future social, cultural, and economic development, really from both the local and global perspective. Really to reflect on, as Omoumi have indicated, on Omorwani. I think I got it right. We thus align our code of business conduct and ethics, specifically around the whistleblower, to try and encourage unethical behavior to be reported, the conflict of interests, and really to try and be transparent in terms of how we have allocated the resources or the fundings that we have through the integrated reporting. Now, we have included our code of conduct of business conduct and ethics into our due diligence to really try and encourage the playing field where specifically the SMEs we want them to thrive. And in our code of ethics, as we have included that into our due diligence for financing transaction, is we do not allow or borrow to businesses or promoters who have been convicted of corruption, bribery, or they have international media exposure that red flag corruption. We also specifically, and that's very important for us, is the prominent influential person or previously considered as PEP, a political exposed person. They are now known as prominent influential person and their associate transaction. We treat those transactions with care and we do enhanced due diligence, and the approval process, irrespective of the authority, is that we do that at committee and board level, really to establish, do we really want to do business with this type of people. We also ensure that we sanction screen individual. We're doing this for society so that we do not do business with countries that really allow or encourage state capture, money laundering, and so forth. And we blacklist the people that we have probably already financed, and during the transaction they commit unethical or corruption or bribery during the transaction relationship. At the same time, we have an exclusion list to try and curb the transaction that will have a detrimental impact on society, specifically where we know if we find a specific transaction, it is going to be used for political contribution, campaign contribution, and so forth. But the idea is really to try and do something from our side and considering that we are very vulnerable to state capture utilization of funds. So the use of proceeds for us is key, and we really are strict on that.
Yeah, not only being wide awake about what's happening around you, but also know that you can become a target yourself by means of the very institution that you are. I will come back to the panelists. We are running out of time, so I think there's time for about 2 contributions from the floor, but keep it short and sweet, to the point, confined to a question, and hopefully specifically to a panel member. Then I think that we can address it in that way. So are there any questions before I give the panel just an opportunity to round up and give us a final view? Anybody from the floor? A question that has been triggered, something that's living with you now that you would really like to ask to one of the panelists? I don't want to scare you off, but I just want to confine it to a question so that we have a good use of your time as well. I see there's a hand that's tentative. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, it's me again from Diabetes Speaker. Trevor Manuel, big difference. At an open day faculty at Stellenbosch University at one point said, you cannot be a little bit pregnant. Oh, you cannot be a little bit corrupt, just like you cannot be a little bit pregnant. And it made me think, and I was wondering, are we so far away in African countries with regards to corruption that we don't even know that we are corrupt? And that are there people that maybe it can never be justified, but are there people who don't know that they're corrupt and that a kickback is wrong? It's just a gift.
Okay, all right. So I think there is a question, and panel members think so long. Both of you would like to pick that up. Is there another question?
The question online. I do question online.
And then, so are you talking on behalf of the question online?
Yes. This is a question from Kali. Incomplete transitions is a sad narrative of Africa's socioeconomic political development that continues unabated, providing fertile ground for corruption to thrive at will. Who is benefiting from these incomplete transitions? Why is Africa not learning? Is Africa cursed or captured, as we can seem to be moving out of this conundrum?
Okay, thank you for that one. And there's a third question. Is there a question there?
Thank you. I always wonder about this. We talk about accountability within our institutions, but one of the biggest problems is our political parties who are placing people within our institutions. And how do we hold our political parties to account? Because they all have these fantastic codes of conduct that say all the right things, but there's this consistent lack of accountability, both within the institutions and then within the parties who deploy within the institution. And maybe just some thoughts from the panel members around that.
Good, thank you very much. Now, I'm going to take the initiative here. Samuel, would you like to pick up this last question? How come that politicians give us leaders that are actually exercising their power to the disadvantage of society? So, and with that, Samuel, if you are willing to pick that one up, because you're the human rights lawyer, I think, amongst us. If you would like to pick up on that one, also to add your concluding remark into that as well.
Yes, thank you.
I've actually said Samuel, not Saima. So
Samuel. Okay.
Samuel, are you willing to pick that one up?
Yes, and if you allow me, I pick also Kali's question about who benefits from the state of affairs. I think it's mostly as a result of the imperfections of our electoral system, and I think I've had a chance to reflect on our transitions from the colonial administration at independence, and looked at the caliber of leadership that is finding its way into positions of power and influence, and you realize that we even started quite well. The leaders who are engaged in the struggle for our independence were actually, they were driven by something more noble, more grand than what we see today. They were infilled with the spirit of Ubuntu. They were not doing it for themselves, and many of them actually did sacrifice ultimately their lives to see our countries gain independence. The successive leaders, I think, have been victims, one of successive state capture, where our organizing, whether it is political parties, trade unions, any organizing that authentically contributed to the moving of the African states from the pre-colonial, from the colonial period into the independence, were actually disempowered, I would say that. Their effectiveness has been undermined over time. And I reflect on the Kenyan context, for example, where our trade union movement is nowhere near what it used to be in and around independence. And I think when you have poor, or rather our institutions of organizing are undermined, it basically means that they can be captured for very narrow interests. And how we ended up moving from a situation where the best represented us, if you look at during our struggle for independence and actually our independence leaders, with all their imperfections, you will notice that they were among the best intellectually, in terms of their sacrifices and many other things. But right now, that's not what we seem to be. Our system is not, that's not what our system is producing, because I do think that there are other forces at play to deliver the leaders that we have. And answering Kali's question then, to understand who benefits, we have to look at who are these interests? What are the forces? And I think one, you have the neopolitical forces, that wanted to continue controlling the African states and to benefit from their economic resources, and will do it to enable them to continue accessing those resources. And to do that, they need amenable leaders. So they will put resources. In some cases, they will even sponsor military coups to make sure that, those who stand their ground and espouse the spirit of Ubuntu, those who are immovable in helping them realize their objectives, are actually removed from power or gotten rid of. Then the instruments are usually also through the business instruments, the corporations. The international, multinational corporations have had a significant role to play. And if you look at our politics, you'll see the role money increasingly played. That role was very small at independence. It continues to grow at every election. At least in the Kenyan context, that's the case. It grows at every election. Every successive election is more expensive than the previous one. But if you look at the resources, where do the resources to fund these elections come from? Nobody wants to say, nobody wants to be accountable. It's one of those questions where we have made sure, particularly in Kenya, that you will never get to know who funds those elections. And I want to posit to you that it is actually these interests that fund these elections. Some of them are criminal, others are simply just seeking to undermine the state institutions so that they can continue to rake in profits for their shareholders. And their interests align very well with the interest of our politicians, who want to continue, overseeing a state machinery that serves only narrow interest at the expense of the people. Thank you.
Thank you. The forces behind the scene. I'm going to come to the educationalists here in our midst. Why are we not learning? Why are we not learning? Why does it seem that we are not taking these lessons and turn them into good value? That can take us forward. What's happening in the classrooms, or what's gone wrong in the classrooms?
Yes, I do think.
Did you hear my question?
Sorry.
Yeah,
yes, I did. Yes.
Why are we not learning? I think that was one of the questions. So if I can reach out to you as the educationalist in our midst here, why are we not learning?
Okay, first I'd like to say that though it might seem that we're not learning, maybe not enough of us are learning, maybe the situation. Of course, looking at the panorama, it's important to teach ethics, and it's important that as many academic institutions as possible, incorporate the teaching of ethics either as standalone courses or even better, sometimes embedded into the technical skills that the students are learning. Because I do not think people are unaware that corruption exists or that it is bad. Sometimes it's just that it's a kind of detachment from reality. It's not me, I'm not really that involved. But when it comes to things, they think they're little things that are not really affecting them as persons. So if we're able to, already incorporate ethical considerations in our teaching so that we in the academic institutions, we don't just have people who are knowledgeable in technical skills or who are very good experts in the professional life, but people who also are concerned about the character. So you have your students growing both in knowledge and character, then would have a better outlook for the future. And I think there are many ways to do this. And one of the challenges we have sometimes is that people have a lot of theoretical knowledge. They're not aware of how to turn them into practice. And there are programs that are trying to put this. For example, Mary Gentile has given voices to value that helps people to think, okay, what are the values? So you teach the people the values, but then you help them to manifest it. And I think with that, we'll be addressing what the keynote talked about the supply side of managing corruption. We begin to influence the people who are going to pay the bribes if they don't think that is an alternative or if they're not knowledgeable of ways in which they can avoid it. So I'd say one of the things we could do is that thing of trying to find ways to move from to teach ethics first of all, and then to make sure that when we teach the ethics, we make sure that people know what to do and they have the tools that need to navigate the difficult terrain in which they find themselves. And another contribution is to focus the courses or the knowledge in such a way that it's not just the knowledge of what is corruption, but also to consider the humanistic approaches to managing ethical behavior. So we think about people knowing what is right, but what are the emotional drivers or what are the influences in their sociocultural context? Is there peer pressure? Simon mentioned people asking, or children asking, well, this other person has a car that they can't afford. Why don't we have one? So sometimes there's the pressure from people around you to be involved in those corrupt practices. But if we have ways in which ethical knowledge or courses in ethics keep in mind all these different factors that influence behaviors or may more or less, make people want to be involved, then we'll be able to have,
I think that's a very important point.
Have those effective ethical, thank you.
I'm very conscious of the fact that we're actually now into other people's time. Seima, a short word from you and a concluding word then from Gaspar here with me. So Seima, a last word from your side. That's not Samuel, it's Saima.
Yes. I think from my side is it starts with us, it starts with me, it starts with you to try and change and recognize and discourage fertile behavior which encourage state capture to thrive on. It also starts from home. When we have children that we need to teach, I just enter a comment there where I said, from my experience of small tutoring, students complain that ethics is hard. Why is it hard to behave ethically? That's really where we are. It starts with you and me.
Thank you so much. Gaspar, last word is yours.
Thank you. I think that there is need to actualize our system values and translate all the democracy principles with our system values. Otherwise, we'll keep talking, we'll keep arguing, but we won't change. Because as it was said by the previous colleagues, the state is captured. So what they will try to do, if the concept remains the same, we will continue under the same cycle, will not change. So there is need to go back and rebuild concepts. reveal the concept of democracy, the concept of elections, the concept of education, so that it responds for what you want to achieve in our near future.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to each panel member. I just want to conclude with two remarks. I think, colleagues, what we've seen here is the moment that we start talking about something that is so pervasive and so systemic, something that we are actually a part of, and we try to change that which we are a part of, it becomes, I think, a massive challenge. I think we also saw that as we focus on something that seems to be a challenge, a topic, something such as state capture out there, it's actually difficult to focus on that as a single-minded focus for conversation. In the end, we have to talk about ourselves. In the end, we do veer into the direction where we talk about humanity, about us, about relationships, about how we grow up, about how we teach, how we educate, how we empower. And thank you for our panel members enlightening us on that. And thank you for participating from the audience side.
Thank you very much. It has run a little bit longer, but we knew because it's a very interesting and very current topic. Thank you so much. And again, once again, a round of applause.
Please.